At 6:58, on the morning of October 25th, 1944, the sea off Samar was a flat sheet of steel, gray and silent, as if the Pacific itself were holding its breath. On the bridge of a small destroyer named USS Johnston, a 5-year-old captain pushed aside the canvas flap and stepped into the wind. His name was Ernest Evans, half Cherokee, half Irish, all grit. The war had already turned him into a legend among his crew. But what he was about to do would etch his name into naval history forever. Ahead of him, on a horizon blurred by mist, something enormous was taking shape. At first, the silhouettes looked like clouds or distant islands, but then the sunlight caught on steel, layered decks, towering masts, and pagoda-shaped bridges. Evans lifted his binoculars, and in that moment, the mystery became a nightmare. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, a swarm of destroyers. The entire Japanese center force, bearing down on the smallest American task unit in the Philippines. Taffy 36 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts was never meant to fight a fleet. They were support ships, thin-skinned, slow, vulnerable. Their aircraft were airborne with half fuel and often without bombs. They were built to assist an invasion, not survive an ambush by giants. But somehow, through a crack in the American lines, the Japanese had slipped through, unseen, and now their guns, some capable of firing shells heavier than a pickup truck, were pointed directly at Evans and his tiny tin can. The first distant booms rolled across the sea like thunder. A few seconds later, towering white columns erupted behind the escort carrier's shell, splashes nearly 200 feet high. The message was clear. The enemy had found them. Admiral Clifton Sprague ordered Taffy 3 to flee east and lay smoke. It was the logical decision. It was the safe one. But Captain Evans was not thinking about safety. He was thinking about duty. He grabbed the voice tube, leaned into it, and spoke a sentence that shocked every man on board. "Full speed ahead. Hard left rudder. We're going in." The destroyer shuddered as her engines roared to life. Men stumbled on deck. A gunner looked up in disbelief. Johnston wasn't running away. She was charging straight at an enemy force 10 times her size. The ship's smoke generators roared, belching a thick, gray curtain across the sea. It swallowed the escort carriers behind them and cast Johnston into a churning, ghost-like silhouette. Evans knew the math. A single destroyer could not duel battleships. Their guns could erase him from the ocean with a single direct hit. But if he could close the distance, if he could get within torpedo range, he might punch a hole in their armored spearhead. His crew moved with frantic precision. Men sprinted shells to the forward guns. Others tightened hoses, lashed loose cables, or checked firing pins with trembling fingers. They had heard Evans' speech when Johnston was commissioned. "This is a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way." Now, as the Japanese battle line grew larger with every passing second, the meaning of those words settled into their bones. Harm's way wasn't coming to them. Evans was steering them straight into it. Johnston's 5-inch guns opened fire at maximum elevation. Their small shells arced high into the pale sky, aimed at the lead cruiser, Kumano. Sparks burst along the cruiser's bow. Tiny wounds against a steel giant. But this wasn't about killing the enemy with gunfire. This was distraction, disruption. Every second Kumano spent zigzagging and adjusting its fire was a second gain for the defenseless escort carriers behind Johnston. Shells from the Japanese battleships screamed overhead, some landing so close they lifted Johnston's hull clean out of the water. Men clung to railings. The deck tilted as if the sea itself were trying to throw them off. Evans stood exposed on the open bridge, ignoring shrapnel that whistled past his head. He shouted course changes, driving Johnston in a zigzag pattern so unpredictable that even veteran Japanese gunners struggled to track her. At 7:24, they reached the edge of torpedo range. 10 long, narrow tubes waited below deck, Johnston's only weapon capable of sinking a ship many times her size. Evans slammed his fist onto the command rail and barked the order. "Fire all fish." 10 white wakes launched across the dark water. The destroyer rolled as she turned hard into the smoke, disappearing before the enemy guns could lock in. Behind the smoke, No one aboard Johnston could see the impact. But far beyond the gray curtain, a violent flash tore through Kumano's bow. One of the torpedoes struck home with the force of a hammer hitting glass. The cruiser's forward section erupted, steel curling like paper in a furnace. For a few seconds, the Japanese fleet hesitated. It made no sense. A single destroyer had charged them and crippled one of their cruisers in full view of the entire battle line. Confusion rippled through their formation, a momentary fracture in an otherwise perfect wall of steel. But that pause didn't last. Dozens of enemy guns shifted toward the smoke cloud where Johnston had vanished. Their shells thundered down like meteors, shaking the sea with each impact. The destroyer reappeared briefly through the haze, damaged, but still fighting. Her forward gun turret took a direct hit. The explosion tore through steel plating, killing nearly the entire crew inside. Smoke burst from the shattered turret as men dragged the wounded out onto the open deck, where they could breathe more than fire and dust. Evans didn't flinch. He ordered Johnston to swing back into the fight. They were wounded now, slower, bleeding speed and power. But as long as her guns could fire, Johnston still had teeth. Meanwhile, the escort carriers behind them launched every aircraft they had. Some planes carried bombs. Others carried nothing except machine guns and empty racks. But the pilots took off anyway, determined to protect their floating home with whatever they could muster, even bluff. Wildcats and Avengers dove again and again on the Japanese warships, strafing decks, dropping makeshift bombs, and when out of ammunition, making mock attack runs solely to disrupt enemy fire control crews. Against battleships, the planes looked like gnats. But gnats can be maddening in a storm. From above, the pilots could see the chaos Johnston had created. The Japanese formation was no longer a clean battle line. It was a fractured swarm of ships trying to avoid torpedoes, dodge incoming aircraft, and keep their guns trained on targets hidden by smoke. Evans used that chaos as cover. Johnston re-emerged from the haze, firing at the nearest cruiser with the few guns she had left. At this range, the destroyer's small shells tore apart rangefinders, radar housings, and exposed crew on the enemy decks. They weren't killing the ship, but they were blinding it. By 8, the entire world around them dissolved into noise, gunfire, splashing water, dive bomber engines, and the sharp ringing of metal striking metal. The horizon was gone, replaced by a wall of black smoke and drifting shadows. On the Japanese flagship Yamato, Admiral Kurita watched the developing battle with growing confusion. His officers reported multiple American cruisers and destroyers attacking them. But something was wrong. The enemy seemed too aggressive, too coordinated, too numerous. He didn't know that much of what he saw was illusion. The smokescreens, the frantic aircraft, the relentless destroyer charge. It all suggested a larger U.S. force than what truly existed. Johnston's suicidal run had created the impression of an entire task force counterattacking. Meanwhile, USS Hole, another tin can, began her own torpedo run. Like Johnston, she disappeared into smoke before unleashing her torpedoes at the battleships. Heermann joined in soon after, firing salvos at warships 20 times her size. Taffy 3's destroyers had become a wall of defiance, 3 ships against an armada, each throwing themselves at the spearhead of the Japanese fleet with a desperation born not from panic, but from duty. Back aboard Johnston, Evans was losing control of his ship. A shell had taken out steering. For several agonizing minutes, the destroyer spun in wide, helpless circles, her engines whining as crews scrambled to restore manual control. But even while drifting, Johnston's remaining gunners kept firing. They aimed at muzzle flashes in the smoke, at shadows moving in the haze, at any threat that dared to close in. Every hit they scored added another moment of uncertainty to the Japanese command staff. Finally, the crew managed to restore partial steering. Johnston limped forward, rolling under the weight of battle damage. Most captains would have withdrawn, or at least attempted to regroup. Evans instead turned directly back toward the enemy again. He lined up his battered ship on a burning cruiser and ordered his gunners to open fire. The crew responded instantly, sending a stream of shells that walked across the enemy's deck, smashing through open hatches and igniting scattered fuel. For a brief moment, Johnston appeared larger than she was, a streak of motion cutting across a field of giants. refusing to die, refusing to surrender even an inch of ocean to the enemy. Far across the battle line, Admiral Kurita saw the flashes of gunfire, the smoke screens, the swarming aircraft, and the relentless destroyers charging through hell. He hesitated. Something felt wrong. This didn't look like a weak escort group. It looked like a trap. Johnston was burning now thick, dark smoke rising from her forward deck, but even as flames clawed at the superstructure, her guns refused to go silent. The destroyer shuddered with every recoil, fighting back with a stubborn will that defied the reality of her wounds. On the starboard side, sailors battled the fires with hoses that whipped under the pressure of seawater. The deck was slick with oil and shards of metal, but they kept moving, bracing themselves against the tilting hull as another shell blast rattled the entire ship. Across the battlefield, a Japanese cruiser already mauled by earlier attacks suddenly lurched out of formation. Flames licked across its deck, smoke pouring from shattered compartments. The once formidable vessel was now fighting simply to stay afloat. Then, through the thick curtain of smoke, the silhouette of USS Heermann emerged. The destroyer was charging straight toward the Japanese battleships, guns blazing, wake foaming violently behind her. If Johnston had been the spark, Heermann was now the flame following it. On the Japanese side, officers peered through binoculars, their vision distorted by smoke and mist. The battlefield made no sense. Destroyers kept appearing and disappearing. Aircraft dove repeatedly, and every shadow looked like another incoming torpedo attack. And then came the moment no one on Taffy 3 could have predicted. The massive battleship Yamato Pride of the Imperial Navy began to turn away. Her colossal hull carved a sweeping arc through the water, leaving a spiraling wake as she reversed course. Japanese signal ships flashed frantic messages, flags rising and falling, lamps blinking in rapid patterns. Orders rippled across the enemy line: regroup, reform, fall back. Their advance had turned into hesitance, and hesitance into retreat. Soon, the entire Japanese fleet was withdrawing, slipping into a wall of rain and smoke. Their enormous silhouettes grew smaller and smaller until they were nothing more than shapes swallowed by the horizon. Taffy 3 had survived the impossible, but Johnston would not survive to see the victory she helped create. Listing heavily, the destroyer groaned under her own weight. Fires raged unchecked, and seawater surged through shattered bulkheads. The crew knew the end was near. As the order was given to abandon ship, sailors helped each other across the mangled deck. Some carried wounded men on makeshift stretchers. Others held onto railings slick with oil as the destroyer tilted dangerously toward the sea. Captain Evans remained on the stern, still helping wounded sailors, still refusing to put on a life jacket, still doing everything he could to save others before himself. His silhouette stood firm, framed by smoke and fire, a captain in every sense of the word. Moments later, USS Johnston began her final descent. The bow dipped beneath the surface, water rushing over the forecastle. The ship that had charged an entire fleet now slipped gradually into the deep, leaving only bubbles and floating debris behind. Survivors clung to life rafts scattered across the open ocean. The sea around them was calm again, disturbingly calm, its surface broken only by bits of wreckage and the exhausted hands of men calling for help through salt-stung voices. Among the drifting debris floated a single steel helmet, rolling gently on the oily waves. To the men nearby, it was a quiet reminder of how thin the line was between those who lived and those who didn't. Hours later, American rescue ships arrived. Sailors reached over the rails, hauling survivors aboard with trembling hands. Some men were barely conscious, others dazed, all of them carrying the weight of what they had just endured. Back on land, command officers began piecing together the battle. Chalkboards filled with scribbled notes, maps spread across desks, lines drawn and redrawn. Only then did the full scope of Taffy 3's stand become clear. 3 destroyers and a handful of carriers had turned away a force meant to crush an entire invasion. In the days that followed, Captain Evans was recommended for the Medal of Honor. The medal would become the symbol of a man who had done the unthinkable, who had charged into certain death not for glory, but to give others a chance to live. A small memorial was set up, just a framed photograph, a pair of dog tags, and a folded flag. His face was calm in the picture, almost ordinary. No one would guess that this man had changed the course of a battle by sheer willpower and audacity. The sea off Samar eventually returned to its quiet rhythm. Waves rolled gently across the blue expanse where steel giants had once traded hellfire. The calm surface hid the memory of the chaos that had raged beneath the same sky. Years later, in a quiet naval museum, a model of USS Johnston sits in a glass case. Visitors walk past it without knowing that the ship before them had once charged into a fleet far larger than itself and, for a few incredible hours, changed the fate of a war. Don't forget to hit subscribe to discover more untold stories of World War II.